Coming onto this project, I was initially hesitant to do any sort of scripted intro. There can be so much work. I even mocked up something much simpler, just using stunt run-up shots stitched together. And yet there was still this idea in the back of my mind from many years ago, a stunting themed twist on the glass pane sketch. And so I eventually decided to give it a try. I settled on Sunshine Autos thinking that it presented the most visually interesting scene that could involve breakable windows. Its ramp coming up from behind also fit with the idea that these guys could only see the vehicles coming at the last second. It also seemed like a neat tie-in to the throwback theme of the video, the building being useful in the days before spawners due to its many garages and parked cars, the taking of which would lead to the breaking of these very windows. It made for quite a short intro overall, but I thought that worked quite well, keeping things moving, framed just within the opening of the main song, with a hope to simply set a bit of a fun tone heading into the rest of the video. I was eager to start the video off with one of FreePlay's new tricks, opening in a cinematic camera only for it to suddenly seamlessly become FreeCam right as the music builds up towards the end of the run-up. And then at the end here we also have the first example of me attempting to match the camera or scene on a cut between stunts, something I'd only planned to use occasionally and yet couldn't resist trying over and over, leading to significant use throughout the video. It was made feasible by the newer FreePlay work like that FreeCam conversion, also breakpoints and being able to save and restore different cameras, even detailed settings files. The other important aspect was that I had already mapped out the entire video beforehand, a mock-up using temp clips to plan out the selection and order of stunts, so when it came time to proper capture I already knew when I'd be cutting to and from each stunt. Using mouse-controlled FreeCam like I did here is something I often struggled with, finding it hard to ensure the motions appear smooth as I move the mouse around. It's what led me to add support in an earlier FreePlay for simulated mouse movement via the keyboard, which I then used to capture this grind, taking advantage of its ability to provide a continuous constant rotation, so all I had to do was decide on speed and direction, opting to also ensure I showed off the way the player's foot slides along the edge too, which I quite liked. For this next stunt I perform a roll of the camera so that I can have its behaviour kind of mimicking that of the car as it heads into the wall ride, done using the feature that hijacks camera rotation for the task. It only works well when facing north, but thankfully that's no problem here. I quite like the initial focus here being on the FBI car, with some uncertainty of what's coming up. The idea though was mainly just a side effect of the fact that the stunt had too short a run-up for the time I needed to fill. In addition, most of the FBI cars spawn in late, so if I began with the camera on the Voodoo looking forward, you would see them pop in and it wouldn't look very nice. Thankfully there was this one that does spawn early enough, giving my moving cinematic camera something to look at before it rounds the corner and switching focus to the Voodoo. Having a few cases of stunts nearby each other that also fit well beside each other in the video, I decided to try and make a feature out of them, to see if I could have the camera work join them together in some way. My thinking was then to use the final camera position of the first stunt and film a between shot of the camera moving from there to the next location to then also capture that stunt. Since this would be an untethered camera, it would be hard to get a good capture of the second stunt this way, so I was just going to maybe catch some of the run-up with it and then cut away to a different angle that can show off the rest of it nicely. And that is how I first handled it here, making a distinct cut just before the bike leaves the roof, hopping over to a cinematic camera that gives a worthy capture of the grind itself. However, while working on the second such pair of stunts later in the video, I was able to do it in a way where I could seamlessly transition from the untethered camera into a tethered one that makes stunt 2 look good, and therefore I ended up returning to this pair later to refilm part of it to try and do the same. Thankfully the original between shot had a point where the camera, during its move, passed almost directly through the centre of the bike, so that became the place where I could inject a seamless cut into a cinematic camera and then make the whole thing appear as one. I just had to make sure that I still ended with the camera where I needed it to be to match the start of the already recorded next stunt, so I used some movement limits and an angle lock to help ensure I could get back to that point. This camera work here was tough to get right, too much movement to do via the keyboard, so I had to use the mouse. Even the final version wasn't perfect, wrapping around the girder at the end did seem a bit rushed. The camera spin leading into the grind here is in sync with the bike movement, and that's with help from the save and load FreeCam feature, where holding the load button down lets it constantly update to the saved rotation offset relative to the bike's changing angle. This was one of my favourite shared camera transitions as it matches so well between the two stunts, done with the help again of the save load FreeCam ability. There's still many times where loading the correct camera offsets wouldn't look like a perfect match due to the different vehicles used or the angle of the ground, or like in this one here, the different lean of the bikes. I quite like this cinematic shot here, how the raising of the camera looked with the nearby buildings. Continuing the cinematic camera into the next stunt gave me a nice chance to use the new ability for the cinematic camera to work while on foot. In this case, it could now continue after I'd bailed out of the boat. This stunt transition was partially based on the lyrics, being able to reveal the location of the next stunt right as we hit the chorus, and the song title essentially labels that for us. The white was then just a way to fill that lead up, and being a nice cap to the lighthouse landing where it shows the player turning around to face the camera. Sharing the camera angle between these two stunts was actually a problem, as there was a tree right in the camera's path at the start of this stunt. Since I felt that adjusting the camera too quickly after the match cut would feel abrupt, then my only option was to remove the tree. So I ended up editing the map file and did just that, avoiding the issue. With these stunts, I wanted to edit them together in a way that showed how they differed but without making things feel too repetitive. I also thought it would be kind of cool to see the second stunt at the ready during the first, yet the camera work I was going for didn't really allow me to do that via compositing. So this is what led me to implement the bleed-through feature in FreePlay, as it then allowed me to instead spawn a player and a vehicle to represent the start of the second stunt and have it appear while playing back the replay of the first. This also helped with my approach for combining them, where I opted to show the second stunt begin in the background while the first one was still ending. It meant watching the grind twice, but hopefully it helped to show how, for example, the packer to stoppie part was unique to the first one. I do like to use the stock third-person camera mode every now and then, and I thought it fit quite well here. It did, though, force my hand somewhat for the camera's final position, so I had to zoom in quite a bit here to ensure that the angle would be possible to match on the cut, as this following stunt begins right next to a building on that side. Up next we have a case where I could have matched the camera on the cut, but then I couldn't have got the camera work I really wanted, the cinematic camera looping through the gaps, so I ended up just not worrying about doing a match cut here. I always felt that this was going to be the true test of my nearby stunt transition idea, as these stunts were quite far apart and the music was not going to give me much time to get between them, which is why the camera starts moving the instant the first stunt touches the ground. I then splice in the between shot just after the bike disappears from view, ending it right as the turnaround completes. I figured out the timing for where I needed to have the second stunt be when I cut to it after the turn, so from there I could plan a turnaround to try and ensure that I'd be aiming at that spot, using tilt and rotation limits to help. Even if the turn wasn't perfect, as long as I didn't turn past the point I needed, the adjustment caused by cutting to the second stunt's recording just looked like a tiny extension of the turn and didn't seem out of place. And with that, I had been able to pull off this transition from the untethered between-shot camera to a tethered one, meaning there was no need for an explicit cut, and so became the plan to do the same for all four nearby stunt pairs. With the next stunt beginning in an underground car park, it ended up being easier to plan a match cut by working backwards, so I captured the second stunt and then began work on the first, at its final frame getting a camera angle that matched the start of stunt 2, planning a camera move then from that endpoint to where I wanted it to begin, and then setting limits from that movement so I could replicate it the correct way around for the final capture. While prepping the final capture of a replay, sometimes I'd spot a cool background detail that I hadn't noticed during the mock-up, and my desire to then incorporate it determined my final approach for filming the stunt. One of those times was the cop car that follows behind the bike in this stunt. It does a little jump off the house, almost as if this random pet is trying to do a stunt themselves. I couldn't then pass up the chance to include that, so I made sure my camera work at the end would capture it in the frame. With this stunt having a long airtime, I hadn't been sure how I was going to film it, but once again a background detail came to the rescue. I spotted the tank sitting on the ring, and then it all came together. I would then use the new pan feature to have the camera almost eager to check out the tank itself, getting ahead of the taxi to look towards it before returning to the centre. I knew, however, that this was going to be hard to film, trying to not only get the pan just right, but also the desired camera work either side of it, which included needing very specific rotations, bookending the pan so I could then toggle it on and off seamlessly. This was then the catalyst for breakpoints. Once done, it then allowed me to film this stunt in a much more manageable 3 parts, which I could then stitch back together during editing to appear as one. Coming up is another nearby stunt pair, which thankfully wasn't too bad to put together. They were located right next to each other, and I opted for an approach where I never needed to show them both in the same shot. Partway through the first stunt, I untether the camera and start moving it towards stunt 2, direction locked to be parallel to its upcoming grind, halting the rotation that I used to keep stunt 1 in view as soon as it's finished. I could then save my camera position along this path, meaning I could cut into that movement with my in-between shot, for which I had to plan where to stop the movement and at what angle to ensure that I could be aiming at the start of stunt 2 to swap over to its main capture. I normally would have recorded the stunts using the sunny with clouds weather type to make the sky look a bit more interesting, but knowing that I was going to be stitching the multiple shots together to appear as one, I thought the clouds might end up being a bit problematic for that, so I opted for clear skies instead for this project. In an attempt then to still have the sky be somewhat interesting, I recorded all the stunts with the time of day set to 8:30 AM instead of the usual midday, where the sky still has a nice gradient colours to it. The camera spin here uses a slightly modified rotation behaviour, and just like the roll and pan ones, it can lead to culling issues. Note a chunk of the bridge disappears in the background. The next few stunts here were all captured using a similar approach, moving cinematic camera throughout. I thought this repetition fit quite well here, with the music itself also repeating a common pattern over each of these stunts. Manual camera movements like these became much more reliable for this video, as I'd been able to improve how they were implemented in freeplay. Now syncing the associated memory updates explicitly to the game's frame rate, the movements finally get to be smooth, also now more consistent with movements able to be replicated reliably. The ideal beat to cut away from this stunt occurred as soon as the bike reached the end of the grind, but knowing that the bike was going to hit the water and then cut before that didn't seem right. So I ended up increasing the clip speed as it neared the end so that the beat could instead fire as the bike does hit the water. To make that not look strange meant needing to end the stunt in a frozen camera, and thus for a match cut also starting the next one that way too, planning an angle and position for it which allowed the new bike to appear in the same area of the screen that the prior one exited, while also having the bike pass through the centre of the camera at the bump so I could seamlessly transition back into a cinematic camera that I'd then have following the bike for the rest of the grind. With the upcoming stunt here, I wanted to put extra focus on the circular nature of the grind by having the camera essentially be in the centre of that circle, not moving, just rotating to follow the bike all the way around. I set a breakpoint where I wanted to enter into cinematic camera and begin the move towards the centre, so I could then plan the necessary timing, angle and distance for that. In the end, I filmed the whole thing in 3 parts, having another breakpoint at the end of the grind, which I used to help plan out the final camera work, which involved moving right up back close to the bike to mimic a third-person angle, because that was how I wanted to begin the next stunt. The attempt to match camera on cuts caused another problem on this next one here, as it led to the taxi being almost immediately, briefly, obscured by the wall on the lower left. Rather than avoid the issue by doing something different with the camera, once again I ended up editing the map instead and lowering the height of that wall. An early idea I had for filming this stunt was doing a kind of somersault with the camera. I thought it would be kind of cool, but I actually had no idea if I could do it. Finally getting up to trying it, I had hoped I could just remove the free camera tilt limits, so if you keep moving the mouse up after being directly above the player, it would flip over and keep going around. Unfortunately, the game fights this, never wanting to show the world upside down. Instead, almost acting as if once you had got to that point, you had just rotated it 180 degrees horizontally. I couldn't find a way to prevent this, so in the end I just captured it as is, and then in editing I rotated that part of the footage myself, essentially undoing the game's attempt at preventing the flip, and then finally getting the desired result. The SA map can be kind of weird. The windows on the building here are sometimes lit up, other times not. I had no idea what that was all about, so I just tried to take advantage of it, getting the camera work just right so at least they toggled in sync with the bump. The camera share at the end of this stunt was actually one I had already done in the mock-up, a bit of a proof of concept. Working quite well, it was then part of what pushed me to try for so many more during the final project. The one at the end of this stunt gets a little weird. It's another case where the camera match wouldn't look quite right due to rads, but rather than just not trying, I instead went for an environmental match, where I get the black spot of the chimney to become the FBI car when it cuts. That said, this stunt does end with the camera share into its following rad starting stunt. To look right, the 2 cameras had to differ but still seem equivalent, with the first one needing a top-down angle to pull off a match to the behind angle used for the wheeling start to the second stunt. The match didn't feel quite right if I just cut between them, so I found it better with the slow wipe, giving time to get used to the change of focus where the ground essentially becomes the side of buildings. For the opener of part 2, I knew I wanted a moving cinematic shot that flew in from a distance through the bridge to slowly then catch up and follow the bike, but I had no plans for how I'd actually connect it to the end of part 1, if at all. The circle wipe came from just playing around during editing, as did then the idea to rotate the prior stunt as it shrinks away to get the old bike to then match the angle of movement of the new one. That was just kind of poking fun at myself for all the other camera share matches I'd been doing throughout the video. Another small change I made to the game was to edit all particle files to extend the range at which sparks will generate, knowing that I'd likely often have the camera be at a distance from vehicles that would exceed the default limit. The attempted match cut here was a bit odd, going from a car to a boat. I went with an angle that tried to focus on their similar rectangular shape. Thankfully there was still time to get the camera from here to the spot needed to actually get the shot I really wanted, which was having the boat fly over the cameraman's head essentially during the bump. The upcoming stunt was another one where I decided to use the ability to hold down the FreeCam load button, doing it during the airtime to let the camera maintain its relative position to the bike. But with the next stunt beginning in a camera further away, I'd considered redoing this one such that I'd be zooming out while holding down the load button to be able to get a match at the end. But all that zooming combined with the rotation just seemed a bit much, so instead I kept the simpler version and didn't worry about having a match. The plan for capturing the wall ride here was to essentially have the cinematic camera be doing the wall ride itself, done in reverse so that it could pass by the bike in the middle, and then getting to save the reveal of that stuck bike until the end, right as the gap it creates gets driven through. Coming up is the first of the two main uses of compositing to show multiple stunts simultaneously. With these, my options for capture were limited by the need to only use camera work that I could replicate for each stunt. The distance limits and direction locks could help for straight line movement, but actually turning the camera wasn't really an option. My final camera work here then tries its best to satisfyingly show both stunts despite the limitations, with an angle and basic straight line movement that allows both bikes to be seen at all times. Also, they never overlapped with each other, which definitely helped with the compositing. Just then was another random attempt at matching the scene on the cut rather than the camera. The initial extreme close-up of the player in the vehicle done so that they'd take up a similar portion of the screen as the silo did, and the player having no shirt kind of made it a similar colour to the silo as well. It is a bit odd perhaps to obscure most of the run-up here, but I really liked the look of splitting off and going above the overpass with the camera, though it did mean having to begin with a very quick zoom out to get the necessary height. The syncing for this stunt was interesting, trying to not only get the lift off, the bump and the landing time to the music, but also some of the tank firings too, something I hadn't even considered during the mock-up, so I was kind of lucky that they were even feasible. It wasn't all a frame-perfect match, but overall I thought it fit pretty nicely. I altered the camera speed on the fly during this stunt, moving quite fast to begin with to catch the bike and to pass it in time with the music, but then slowing things down so I can keep close to it until the end. While seeming to be fitting partner stunts, the upcoming tank ring and the subsequent grinds were only placed together due to matching the music well. During the final capture, I was happy to realise that they also offered a perfect opportunity for cutting between them, to match up the curve of the ring to that of the bridge's on-ramp. The random camera moves at the end were just to help me get into a good spot for that match, which I ended up putting extra emphasis on by staggering the cut. The compositing of these stunts was a bit challenging, with both sharing the same rail yet grinding at different speeds, which, to get the timing I wanted, meant having parts where the bikes would actually cross paths with each other. Being able to get these overlaps to look good was a bit of a question mark for me, as I wasn't able to fully automate the masking process, needing manual frame-specific adjustments to help make it work, but thankfully it did come out quite nicely in the end. For this upcoming cut, I try for a scene match between the side platform of the bridge and the side wall of the hangar. Since it ended with a frozen camera, I also wanted to start that way here too, only swapping to a cinematic partway through. For the camera work on the next stunt, my thinking was that we'd already seen the exact same run-up in an earlier one, so I wanted to do something different here. Following the bike from the next block over and just seeing glimpses of it at the intersections, it was a bit of a weird idea, and I wasn't sure if people would like it, but I just loved how it looked, even more so with the frozen camera ending where we get a nice view of the grindish aspect of the landing. The angle I chose for that end was also influenced by my idea to try and get a cut where I could match the shape of the building to the shape of Mount Chiliad, which lined up surprisingly well. Wanting to start frozen since I'd ended that way, this also meant having to plan out a cam move that allowed me to transition back into a tethered camera during the stunt. My PC really did struggle during this project, so getting the camera work right during captures wasn't the only concern. There was also the chance of lag. Worst thing is, it usually wasn't obvious during filming, only when I'd watch the footage back. Near the end of the project, I even did a frame-by-frame run-through to check for any cases that I'd missed. Finding a few, I then had to go back and try and fix, multiple even in this very stunt. I had an issue with capturing this run-up, as the van parked outside the bank was always in view of the camera and yet wasn't being rendered all that time, its late appearance then being a distraction during the stunt. Now, while it wasn't a use case I had in mind initially, the bleed-through feature did kind of help me out here, as enabling that meant I could get the non-replay version of that van appearing consistently for the entire replay, thus covering up the delayed rendering of the proper one. This upcoming join was a real satisfying one to get, being able to match both the side of buildings and the ground level. Once again, the wipe served a dual purpose, not only to show it off a bit more, but also to fill in time, letting me justify a few seconds of seeing both stunts stationary. The sharp camera angles used here caused a bit of a problem with the rendering, seemingly just a quirk of the game engine. The top of the building on the left side of the screen wouldn't appear until after it should have already been in view, causing yet another case of a distracting rendering pop-in. My solution was to try and hack at memory to fix it, managing to show the building but only at a lower quality model, and affecting the models of a bunch of other things as well. So I had to composite two captures together to try and get the best of everything here. While having sparks show up in stunts like these should not be particularly noteworthy, for this project their appearance wasn't always guaranteed. There was an issue with free play, I think, due to the way it implemented replay pausing, which is to essentially reprocess the current frame over and over, meaning if that frame wanted to render sparks, they would be repeatedly generated. I'm thinking that often led to a breakage of the entire particle system. Unfortunately then it wasn't uncommon for me to be in the middle of a capture session and sparks would just stop working, something I then had to keep an eye out for the entire project. For the cut at the end of this stunt, I went again for a kind of environmental match, getting the angle of the building roofs to be exactly the same as the angle of the roadway at the start of the ambulance stunt. And then with this ambulance stunt, its placement here allowed for some nice syncing of the flips and the landing to the music, but there was still one remaining beat afterwards before I was ready to cut away, so I figured why not cap the stunt off at that point by just randomly turning the sirens on. A side effect of the particles being mucked up by pausing was the strange appearance of the sand at the start of this stunt. While temporarily paused at my initial breakpoint just before I needed the capture to begin, the sand particles kind of built up into this thick band, and I thought it actually looked kind of neat, so rather than avoid it, I just let it happen. And indeed it was kind of all particles that could potentially get affected by this bug, as I also had to try and keep an eye out for the tank shooting effects not working as well, as that too would happen from time to time. For this, my last case of nearby stunt transitions, the timing between the two stunts was quite short, so I needed to move the camera into a good position for the second stunt during the first. The position I chose meant that at the very end, both landing spots would actually be in frame, allowing me a chance to use bleed-through one last time to get both stunters shown together in that final shot too. On hitting the CSM, I have the camera move an increasing distance away from the player, hopefully showing the stunt nicely while also allowing me to get into position for a match cut on the feeling of the vehicle rounding a corner at a distance. Beginning the final stunt this way also gave me a good excuse for one last FOV zoom, and I really liked how it looked zooming back out as the tank passes the camera. Ending here with syncing the tank's firing to the final beat was a nice surprise, with the rotation around to the back of the tank that revealed it only planned as a way to lead into the outro. I thought it'd be a bit of fun to return to these guys here at the end, so their scenes kind of bookend the video. The idea being that they've finally finished their work, ready to pack it in, before once again having a stunter mess things up for them. Using that classic hot ring spawn on the second floor, so unlike the times in the intro, this last one they don't see coming. There was around 100 stunts submitted for this project, and I was able to squeeze around 85, I think, into the video, with the credits here helping me find a home for these last few that I still really wanted in. This stunt being here also felt like the perfect way to show everyone involved, allowing me to have the name scrolling across the wall during the grind, and the best part being that the bike is then essentially slowly grinding towards its own name tag, the final one in the list, and meeting each other at the very end. Signing on to this project was a bit daunting, knowing it would be my first edit in almost a decade, and a big collaboration at that. And there were definitely a few points during the 6 months that I worked on it where I found myself wondering what on earth I had been thinking agreeing to do it, but I am very glad that I did. I kind of let myself go a little weird with the initial camera work here, only returning to a more normal cinematic camera at the bump. that conversion done using distance and rotation limits to help me hit the mark, plus some trial and error and luck to hit both limits together and at the correct time. Regarding the tools listed here, I used Inject SMAA to provide anti-aliasing, something I hadn't done in a video before, opting for this generic DLL mod rather than trying to force it via the graphics card, as I felt it gave me better results and performance on my PC. Footage was captured via OBS lossless instead of my usual go-to of Fraps, as I found both gave me similar quality, but I was unable to get the latter to record the SMAA effect. I also was in uncharted territory for editing, having only ever used Premiere but no longer having access to it, so I started looking for decent freeware options. Considering DaVinci Resolve first until realising it didn't play nice with the lossless footage, instead landing on the open source Kdenlive, which worked quite well. And last but certainly not least, ModLoader, which was just awesome and a fantastic time saver during the capturing process. And here, with the closing stunt, I felt like I finally had a good spot where I could give the new slow-mo feature a go. Having a little bit of time to spare and a stunt where the meat of it was so brief that I felt I needed some way to put extra focus on it, slowing it down then letting me do just that. Being back involved in the community again these last couple of years has been good fun. It seems fitting, I suppose, that my return, starting simply as just one random nostalgia-fueled check-in of the forums, led to here, now having worked on this project that's all about celebrating and revisiting some of our favourite stunts of the past. I'm really happy with how the main video turned out, and I've found looking back over the process for this commentary a satisfying way to finally cap off the entire project. Thanks for watching.